What's good? What's good? In my last video, I mentioned that I was going to do a reading from this book, Third World Women and the Politics of Feminism. Excuse me. This little section is titled Violence in the Other Country, China as Crisis, Spectacle, and Woman by Ray Chow. On June 4th, 1989, after weeks of peaceful demonstrations by Chinese civilians for reform and democracy, the Chinese government sent troops and tanks to massacre hundreds at Beijing's Tiananmen Square. In the following weeks, Chinese armies were ordered to clean up the mess they had created. Soldiers became so socially constructive that they cut civilians' hair on the streets of Beijing. Meanwhile, hundreds were arrested and tried, and an unknown number executed. Benedict Anderson, and this is a reference, so something they wrote in 1983 on page 68, in a footnote in his book Imagined Communities, Reflections of the Spread of Nationalism, says, quote, "So, as European imperialism smashed its insouciant way around the globe, other civilizations found themselves traumatically confronted by pluralisms which annihilated their sacred genealogies. The Middle Kingdom's marginalization to the Far East is emblematic of this process," unquote. The fact of China's marginalization in the 20th century world is obvious. It is a marginalization that makes us think of it as the other country. However, Anderson's remarks contain another equally important point, if only in passing. In the word traumatically, the trauma faced by Chinese people in the whole process of modernization has yet to be properly understood. The Tiananmen incident confronts us with this fact. The first point about this trauma is the futility of intellectual discourse at the moment of shock. There is nothing subtle, nothing reflexive about a government gunning down its own, or for that matter, any people. This experience shocks us out of our assumed categories of thinking. All of a sudden, those of us who are academics cannot see the world as scholars, but rather become journalists. We become suddenly aware of the precarious, provisional nature of our discourse, the unreliability of conventional sources of information, the limitations of our reasoning instruments, the repetitive narratives to which we are subjected. All these raw aspects of our representational machinery suddenly become acute, plunging our perception into crisis. I heard a feminist ask, how should we read what is going on in China in terms of gender? My immediate response to that question was and is, we do not, because at the moment of shock, Chinese people are degendered and become simply Chinese. To ask how we can use gender to read a political crisis such as the present one is to insist on the universal and timeless sufficiency of an analytical category and to forget the historicity that accompanies all categorical explanatory power. In her essay, Explanation and Culture, Marginalia, Gayatri Spivak, 1987, page 105, writes, "The will to explain was the symptom of a desire to have a self and a world. The possibility of explanation carries the presupposition of an explainable, even if not fully, universe, and in explaining, even if imperfectly, subject. These presuppositions assure our being. Explaining, we exclude the possibility of the radically heterogeneous. End quote. Any analytical discourse on the Chinese situation in terms of a single category, when Chinese pre-democracy protesters are being arrested, punished, or killed for having demonstrated peacefully for freedom, is presumptuous. The problem is not how we should read what is going on in China in terms of gender, but rather, what do the events in China tell us about gender as a category, especially as it relates to the so-called third world? What are gender limits? Where does it work? And where does it not work? How do these events help us recognize the anger often voiced by non-Western women about the singular priority that is given to woman by bourgeois liberal feminism? The roots of this anger do not simply lie in the need neglected by bourgeois liberal feminism's agenda to put the female sex in the foremost of all battles, to pluralize the term woman. Women, often used as a remedy for that neglect, leaves most problems of social inequity intact. If the more trendy woman itself, at best, an unstable category, it is because, as Denise Riley tells us, this instability has a historical foundation. The anger felt by non-Western women is never simply that they have been left out of bourgeois liberal feminism's account as women, but more important, that their experiences as women can never be pinned down to the narrowly sexualized aspect of that category as women versus men only. What is often assumed to be the central transaction between women and culture, women's heterosexual relation to men, has little relevance to the China crises. China watching. Rather than a purely analytical discourse on the China situation, I want to raise a set of questions that pertain more closely to us in the US, where most of us participate in China watching as TV audiences and newspaper readers. China is, in this instance, as it has been for the past several decades, a spectacle for the West. Our condemnation of the military violence in Beijing must go hand in hand with the understanding that the deaths of the thousands of Chinese people were an overdetermined event. In many respects, the media all over the world perform the function of urging those protesters on. Our cameras lie in wait for the next newsworthy event to unfold before us. When I say overdetermined, therefore, I mean to include the complicity of our technology, which does much more than enable us to see. Since the week of June 11, 1989, for instance, the focus on the China crisis has shifted to how the Chinese government is controlling the dissemination of the news and how it is, after the military crackdown, instituting the control of thought and speech through propaganda. The Chinese authorities are ruthless in their deployment of camera networks and other mass communication channels to track down dissidents. The crudity of their technologies of indoctrination is transparent. They kill and then they lie. But what role do the media play on our side? There have been instances in which Chinese people cautioned photographers not to take their pictures for fear they would be arrested. And what happens to them? We see their pictures with their cautioning as explanation of the China crisis, either in the form of a silent caption in the newspapers or in the voiced commentary of our reporters on television. This happened even in the same reports that criticized the Chinese government for issuing telephone numbers so that people could turn others in. Even though some newscasters now take the trouble to obscure the faces of the people they interview, in some cases it is too late. Meanwhile, these newscasts continue to take us to more remote places, such as villages, where they continue to film people and try to make them talk. To use a familiar narrative from the archives of imperialism, we are still locked within the political structure of the movie King Kong, the 1933. With our media always ready to venture out to make a movie about the unknown jungle with its dark, abominable secrets, much like the director Denham's film crew, our cameras capture the inhuman monster and present it to us in the civilized world as a spectacular sight on display. King Kong was mounted on a rack for a well-dressed theater audience in New York City. China is served to us on the television screen at home. I'm just going to read a little more. My back is killing me. Describing what she calls the civilizing power of socialized capital, Spivak says the irreducible search for greater production of surplus value, that is dissimulated as simply productivity, through technological advancement. The corresponding necessity to train a consumer who will need what is produced and thus help realize surplus value as profit all conspire to civilize. Holy crap, I want to read that again. This is Spivak. It says, the irreducible search for greater production of surplus value, dissimulated as simply productivity, through technological advancement, the corresponding necessity to train a consumer who will need what is produced and thus help realize surplus value as profit, all conspire to civilize. Recast in the realm of ideological production alone, Spivak's remarks explain the frantic simulation of information knowledge in what I'd call the King Kong syndrome. This is the cross-cultural syndrome in which the third world, as the site of the raw material that is monstrosity, is produced for the surplus value of spectacle, entertainment, and spiritual enrichment for the first world. The intensive productivity of the Western news person leads to the establishment of clear boundaries. Locked behind the bars of our television screens, we become repelled by what is happening over there, in a way that confirms the customary view, in the US at least, that ideology exists only in the other anti-US country. I'd like to meet this Spivak person. Okay. In King Kong, the white woman, Anne, played by Fay Wray, is the point of struggle between the film crew and the natives. Within her society, Anne occupies the position of the underprivileged, herself the victim of patriarchal oppression, an oppression that includes her being lifted into the role of heroine as a result of hunger and thus made part of the profit-making film industry. The white woman becomes the hinge of the narrative of progress between enlightened instrumental reason and barbarism lurking behind the wall. The white woman is what the white man produces and what the monster falls for. If her body is, in filmic language, the place of suture, what it sews together, what it coheres, are the white man's production and the monster's destruction. The King Kong syndrome surfaces in the China crisis in the way the goddess of liberty is reproduced across Chinese communities as a defiant emblem of what China lacks: democracy. The first replica of the goddess of liberty was constructed at the Beijing Academy of Arts at the height of the Tiananmen demonstrations. After the statue was mowed down with the protesters on the morning of June 4th, Chinese groups in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the US produced other replicas in a concerted effort to attack the Chinese Communist government's scandalizing acts. King Kong ends with the statement, "Beauty killed the beast." In the China crisis, this sounds like a prophecy for the future, and Chinese people in particular, with little intellectual choice of any kind left, feel obligated to condone the statement's prescriptive as well as descriptive meaning. Okay, I gotta stop because my back is just angry, but I just wanted to do a little bit of reading for you all. Thank you very much for listening.